Hello. Welcome to the last session of the Workers' Powers course at this year's Red October. For those who did not attend the previous sessions on workers' power that covered key moments in proletarian history, there was first the coverage of the Black Liberation and League of Revolutionary Black Workers from 1969, and then following that there was a discussion on Quebec General Strike of 1974. This session will focus on 2SLGBTQIA+ liberation and the Great British Miners' Strike of 1984-85. I will start by providing a narrative overview of the strike, followed by Robyn giving an overview of the lesbian and gays support the miners, otherwise known as LGSM. Then we will come together to discuss themes of solidarity that happened during the strike, concluding afterwards with lessons we think could be learned. What you will find as you read more on workers' history is that these instances of struggle are not separate spheres of oppression, divided by spatial and historical boundaries, but rather interconnected promises of rebellion that transcend time and coalesce to form a boundless revolutionary imagining of a better world. Despite all the barriers, contradictions, complexities that come with the strike, workers in all these circumstances united in developing their own class consciousness to fight back against the material conditions imposed on them. The Great British Miners' Strike was no different, and when analyzing further, you will discover how its influence embedded itself across much broader cultures of solidarity, such as queer liberation, most notably, as Robyn will further elaborate on, the lesbian and gays support the miners, the LGSM. Despite how its defeat represented the consolidation of the reactionary transition to neoliberalism in Britain and across the world, the strike served as a catalyst for many in their engagement with political activism, and on a much broader level, ultimately ignited the intersectional recognition of solidarity between workers and 2SLGBTQ+ rights in Britain, alongside fragments of Black and feminist liberation, encapsulating a moment in time where social conscience was truly furthered. Although it's imperative to describe the motivations and actions of the prominent names that dominated the headlines of the era of the strike, such as Margaret Thatcher and Arthur Scargill, it was ultimately the actions and initiatives of those who came from below, the coal-filled communities, the miners' welfares and villages, the working majority at the grassroots level, groups such as LGSM, alongside all other various characteristics and identities that drove the movement and created groups of solidarity in both urban and rural communities. Earlier, like Comrade Santiago said at the talk this morning, to glorify leaders while ignoring the working class masses is anti-materialist, and yeah, it's absolutely true. So to provide like a brief overview, the late 1960s in Britain was a time of expanding trade union membership and growing momentum in regards to an upheaval in labor disputes. Historians often note the period between 1969 and 1974 as being one of the most intense periods of class struggle since the early 20th century. Britain's miners were on the front lines of this class struggle, mainly as a result of their deteriorating working conditions, resulting from pit closures, job losses, and comparatively poor wages. A collective frustration that coalesced into new forms of working class militancy on the front lines. One prominent example that arose from this era, which was developed by the Yorkshire miners, was the concept of flying pickets. So basically, instead of prioritizing their own workplace, flying pickets traveled from pits to pits to convince miners to join the fight, their fight for better working conditions, or to join theirs. A militant strategy that grew exponentially in the 1970s and significantly shaped the 1984-85 strikes. This is what happened during the 1972 National Union of Mine Workers victory at the Salt Lake Coke Works in the West Midlands, the largest workers' protest in Britain since 1926, where around 20,000 workers came together at a mass picket that led to the closing of the plant, an upheaval that ignited the rise of Margaret Thatcher in the faltering Tory party. Thatcher eventually took the place of then Tory Prime Minister Ted Heath after he lost the federal election in 1974. When talking about the specific miners' victory at Salt Lake Coke Works, Margaret Thatcher said in her biography that it was the most vivid, direct, and terrifying challenge to the rule of law that I could ever recall emerging from within our own country. So once in power, you can imagine that Thatcher would utilize all the means at her disposal to avenge the Tories' double humiliation in the historic strikes of 1972 and 74 in order to crush the NUM. But in the meantime, Labour would be the majority government in the late 1970s. During the period that Labour was in power from 1974 to 1979, it worked collaboratively with Trade Unions Congress, reactionary trade union leaderships, and employers to break the bonds and militant gains that workers had won in the preceding years. The result of this government action caused the undermining of worker solidarity, which in turn swung the balance of class struggle back in favor of the employing class, as well as to set the foundation for the Tories regaining power under Margaret Thatcher in 1979. By the 1980s, many socialist and left-wing organizations became disoriented in their approach to combating the evolving circumstances of British capitalism. Because of this change in political landscape that arose alongside the suppression of workers' power, many activists abandoned grassroots and revolutionary politics or simply joined the Labour Party. The material conditions of the British working class itself faced a significant blow as well, where there was not only deteriorating health, welfare, and social services, but Labour implemented such policies as the limits on wages for union workers, in which the leaders of unions enforced heavily. Perhaps the most devastating impact miners specifically faced, though, was from deindustrialization. So while the number of people working in the industrial sector had been declining since 1950, it was severely accelerated by the election of Margaret Thatcher in 1979, whose neoliberal policies, implemented in the first 3 years in office, caused the industrial output of the country to fall by 20%. Deindustrialization was particularly detrimental in London, in which employment in the field had fallen by 40% between 1971 and 1981. Although not always synonymous, deindustrialization and unemployment often go hand in hand, and it was through this rise in unemployment that created common bonds of solidarity amongst dispossessed workers, who were, to quote the Brent Miners support campaign, Olin Thatcher's sinking ship. But the much broader impact of privatization and deindustrialization was the erosion of union membership, which lost about 11.5 million members between 1975 and 1984, having around only 2.5 million by the beginning of the miners' strike. So this was essentially the picture that encapsulated the circumstances of the British miners leading up to 1984-85. The confidence of the rank and file in the NUM had been severely weakened by such policies as the Ridley Plan as well, which provided an outline for the Tories to undermine the trade unions and coal industry through denationalization and special police training for picket lines. While Thatcher gained power in the Tories and began her preliminary plan to wipe out the NUM completely, the union was planning its response through the leadership of Arthur Scargill. Scargill is a very memorable character in the story of the Great Miners' Strike, and came to embody the enemy within, as Thatcher described, organized workers on the picket line. He had led the 1972 strike, as well as helped bring down Heath's Tory government in 1974 with the success of another strike, and he was eventually elected with a strong majority as NUM president in 1982, which represented a radical shift to the left in the union's most senior role. So although there was battles leading up to the strike, the main confrontation with NUM did not occur until Thatcher's re-election in 1983, where the Tories announced the closure of Corton Wood in South Yorkshire, in addition to 4 other pits at the beginning of March 1984. This was when the concept of flying pickets, as described before, were heavily utilized and brought miners from across the country together. 80% of miners in England, Wales, and Scotland walked out of their jobs, adding up to over 150,000 strikers fighting against the plans for widespread pit closures and increased unemployment.
Okay, so earlier this year, Spring in Toronto, and actually Spring chapters all over, screened the movie Pride, which tells the story of LGSM and the miners' strike. And at our Toronto event, we were lucky to have Mike Jackson, one of the founding members of LGSM, call in for a Q&A from Britain. And at our Q&A, he told the origin story of LGSM and told us it was quite simple. One day, Mark Ashton, a young communist organizer, asked his friend Mike if he wanted to join in on taking buckets out to the 1984 London Pride March to collect funds for striking miners. And we asked Mike at the event, we were like, tell us the real scoop. It's got to be more complicated than that. And he was like, no, it was just really that simple. So to kick off my portion of the talk, I'm going to share some of what I've been learning about the social and political context that made such a seemingly simple and spontaneous act, one that kicked off an historic solidarity campaign, possible in the first place. So first, I want to emphasize the pervasiveness of homophobia through the period of time leading up to LGSM's emergence. In 1967, the British government passed legislation legalizing homosexuality so long as, quote, homosexual acts took place between 2 people in the privacy of those people's homes. And the politician who sponsored the bill actually directed a message to gay men on the night the bill passed that reveals, I think, a lot about the terms on which this so-called progress was occurring. So he said, I ask those homosexuals to show their thanks by comporting themselves quietly and with dignity. Any form of ostentatious behavior now or in the future, or any form of public flaunting would be utterly distasteful and make the sponsors of this bill regret that they had done what they had done. So I think this demand for assimilation and respectability by the state as a condition of securing rights, made a kind of gay life possible via property ownership and a commitment to being largely closeted, but it left the majority of queer people in Britain alienated and highly vulnerable to ongoing police brutality and rampant homophobic harassment in all areas of their lives, on the streets, at home, and at work. So the Gay Liberation Front, which formed in the US in the late 60s after Stonewall, was a social movement influenced by the national liberation struggles of the post-war period and really organized itself in defiance of the kind of rhetoric quoted above. The GLF had a significant influence on young queer people in Britain in the 60s and 70s, some of whom began to enter socialist and communist organizations. And the queer people who identified with the politics of the GLF came into social and political activity often through solidarity with other oppressed groups. So by participating in Vietnam War resistance movements, women's liberation movements, movements for Black liberation, even as they struggled themselves against pervasive forms of homophobic violence. And an important tenet of the GLF was being out and proud. This was seen as an act of resistance to the homophobic social order of the time. So during this period, queer leftists who wished to be active in political organizing and be out at the same time struggled to find organizations that welcomed them. The influence of Stalinism had many socialist organizations buying into the notion that homosexuality was a form of bourgeois decadence imposed on the working class by the ruling class. So as one LGSM member, Ray Goodspeed, who organized with the revolutionary socialist organization Militant, shared, Militant was not a particularly pro-gay organization. It wasn't exactly anti-gay, it was just utterly dismissive of the question of homosexuality. That was seen as a personal issue with no relevance to working class politics at all. There was an assumption that homosexuality was a purely middle-class issue and something of an affectation. And the Labour Party's position on LGBT equality was no better. As another LGSM member, Nicola Field, notes, we were trying to pull the Labour Party into having an understanding of equality, and it was very resistant. I had the sense that it didn't want us. It seemed to think that we would bring down the tone of things. But there were key exceptions to these attitudes on the organized left at the time, and two in particular provided an important infrastructure for queer socialists in London to do political work. So the first that I'm going to touch on is Gay's The Word, a bookstore in London that opened in 1979 and still exists today. And Gay's The Word was founded by a socialist group called the Gay Icebreakers. As Martin Goodsell, a member of LGSM and the Socialist Workers' Party, explains, it had been started by an explicitly gay organization, and it was always very open to the developing lesbian and gay communities. The Gay Young Socialists group regularly met there. It was extremely welcoming to us, and I think the staff even used to leave us to lock up in the evenings. It was also the place you went to get your papers and leaflets, where you could find out what was going on, as well as just call in for a chat. And then the Greater London Council was another key site of infrastructure for the political development of LGSM members. Martin Goodsell describes, there was in the early to mid-'80s a coming to the fore of gay and lesbian issues, certainly politically. A lot of left-wing Labour councils up and down the country, particularly in Ken Livingstone's Greater London Council, were starting to actively and very positively take up lesbian and gay issues in a way that hadn't really happened before. The GLC established the London Lesbian and Gay Center. It housed the Labour Campaign for Lesbian and Gay Rights, and it supported the Lesbian and Gay Youth Video Project, which some future LGSM members participated in, including Nicola Field, who shared, we learned all about history and culture and socialist ideas through the project. So the GLC's progressive politics, as you can imagine, made it susceptible to attacks from conservative politicians and the media. And rather than taking a principled stand to protect it, the Labour Party instead distanced itself from the GLC, which was ultimately abolished by Thatcher's government in 1985. So Eric's points about the increased militancy of the labor movement and the miners' tactic of flying pickets also had a direct influence on LGSM members. Both Mike Jackson and another LGSM member have shared how their experiences participating in the mass pickets of the Grunwick dispute, which was a strike at a film processing plant in Britain where a majority of the workers were women of South Asian descent, planted the seeds for LGSM. Mike says, There was one event in particular, but it wasn't LGBT. When I was a student at Keele University, we got on the coach down to the Grunwick dispute, the first mass picket I'd ever been to in my life. There were these Asian women standing on the picket line next to these big, gruff-looking Yorkshire miners who had come to support them. In the 70s, the labor movement was sexist, it was racist, it was homophobic. There was a lot of battling to be done. And so that was just, wow, that's a new alliance. That's good. That would have been 1977 or 78. And perhaps for LGSM, without me realizing, the kernel was planted there. So I think tracing this history is important in understanding how issues of equity and working class struggle coalesce, and how when socialists from oppressed groups are connected to spaces and organizations that welcome us and support us in developing our politics, we can take strategic action at key moments of struggle, just as Mike and Mark did.
So yeah, also present on the picket lines from the beginning was the Socialist Workers' Party, or the SWP, who heavily distributed their copies of their paper, The Socialist Worker. Over 250,000 leaflets and 50,000 posters calling for the victory of the miners were put up in towns and cities across the country, which helped propel the euphoric feeling at the start of the strike. Workers also had their say at mass meetings organized by the SWP, where people had an opportunity to collaborate on ideas. Across the country, there were more than 40 organizations that provided a range of support for the growing strike movements. These organizations were composed of various sets of identities, ranging from feminist support groups, to individual trade unions, to radical black bookshops, to bars, theaters, student unions, and labor clubs, all of which raised funds for their strike in their own unique way. On picket lines themselves, such as the mass picket line at Neasden Power Station in Brent, there was a stage with seemingly endless streams of musicians, poets, and comics who provided solidarity through entertainment for the striking workers. In this sense, the Great British Strike reimagined what was possible on the picket line in terms of providing support and expanded solidarity for miners beyond political spaces.
So while the impulse of Mark and Mike to take up a collection at the '84 Pride March may have been spontaneous, the act of fundraising for striking miners, as Eric was speaking to, was a growing form of solidarity across Britain. Many gay and lesbian people who would join LGSM had already been collecting funds for striking miners through their unions or political organizations. It was the explicit link between working class struggle and organizing together as gays and lesbians that drew people to LGSM. As LGSM members note, while they could have continued to express solidarity as individuals through their unions or organizations, they felt it was necessary to do so collectively and assert themselves as out queer people. So after fundraising at the Pride March, which I should add ended in a rally at the London University Student Union with a speech by a striking miner who was brought in by the gay and lesbian labor campaign I mentioned earlier, Mark posted an ad in London's gay paper calling a meeting the next week, which was where LGSM began. And LGSM emerged in the context of a very sectarian left in Britain. As the word about it got out and more people began to join in on its weekly meetings, Mike and Mark began to see the risk in the campaign being torn apart by infighting. So they brought a resolution to the group a few months into the campaign that proposed organizing on two principles. The first, unconditional solidarity with the miners expressed through the collection of funds. And the resolution stated that LGSM is not in a position to decide how this money shall be used. That's up to the mining communities themselves. And two, that participation in LGSM meetings was contingent on actually taking part in weekly collections. So people could not comment on the politics of the campaign unless they were actively participating in it by collecting funds. And this was key to preventing the group from imploding in sectarian debate. In interviews on LGSM in recent years, members have reflected on the focus and the clarity of the campaign, saying it was the doing that was important. And this clear focus and the resolutions that were developed and passed to ground how LGSM was organizing itself allowed it to build power as a coalition.
As all of the support was occurring within Britain, there was also expanding international solidarity as well. In fact, according to the book The Enemy Within, the 1984-85 miners' strike attracted international support in a way that no other industrial dispute had done anywhere in the world since the Second World War. In every continent, there was a collection of money, food, clothes, and children's toys to help sustain the British strikers on the picket line. The largest contributions came from French and Australian miners who had excellent past relations with NUM leadership. French miners went so far as to dump thousands of tons of coal meant to be brought to England. Several boats containing coal shipments were holed and sunk. Australian miners established an entire embargo that enforced British steel directors to fly out to Australia to try and convince the miners to release their coal. Perhaps the largest form of solidarity came from the Soviet Miners' Union, who came to an agreement to suspend the deliveries of fuel to Britain from so-called underdeveloped countries, or as Michael Parenti accurately describes them, overexploited countries in Soviet ships, which had a substantial impact. This solidarity, as well as the effectiveness of the entire strike itself, was undermined, however, by such countries as West Germany, the United States, and Canada, who continued to import their oil and coal into Britain. So while there was centralized methods of distributing money to the miners, such as the Central London NUM Support Committee, which raised approximately $40,000 every month, this represented a fraction of the total amount of donations, mainly due to the rank-and-file concept known as twinning, which allowed supporters from London and other metropolitan areas to direct their donations to a specific mine or local area, thereby creating direct bonds with the families of rank-and-file miners while bypassing donations to national funds, with the main goal of forging more personal relationships between strikers and supporters, as well as increasing the overall morale in communities. Twinning was a contested topic within the NUM, however, who opposed the strategy at a national level. Their criticisms mainly came from how much money was distributed and allocated in these decentralized streams of donations, which could result in mining communities competing with each other, creating potential division within the strike. This mindset coincided with Scargill's belief in socialism from above, which emphasized that correct centralized leadership and authority is more important than separate spheres of influence, including how donations are distributed to the miners, which is more of like a top-down, bureaucratic method. Because it was incredibly difficult to organize a countrywide support for the miners by ensuring that the mass amount of contributions would be distributed in an equitable way. This provided an opportunity for socialist media to expand their purpose beyond documenting the strike and being present at picket lines. Socialist Worker, the primary newspaper of the SWP, elevated strike kitchens who were in need of donations and also listed mining communities who are yet to be twinned with outside supports, an instance that shows how socialist media played an organizational function in developing networks of solidarity.
So as LGSM's campaign succeeded, its members needed to organize where the funds they were raising would go. And members were aware that the NUM's bank accounts were at risk of sequestration by the government. So they looked to mining support groups to twin with. And socialists in both camps were integral to the twinning relationship that formed between LGSM and the miners' support group in Delaise, the community in South Wales that they ended up twinning with. So a member of LGSM was also in the Communist Party and knew Hywel Francis, who was a communist in South Wales and who was key to running one of the support groups. And Hywel was the one who took the initial call from LGSM members and sent Di Donovan, who was a rank-and-file miner active in the support groups, to London to first meet with LGSM members. And while the film Pride centers on the relationships built between striking miners and LGSM members, I want to emphasize the political work that LGSM members were doing in London to bring gay and lesbian people into class struggle. So collecting was a form of canvassing. LGSM members mobilized their community, engaging in discussion and argument with other queer people while taking collections, and LGSM members became effective at exposing the contradictions and arguments made by those within the LGBTQ community that gay people should limit their focus to gay issues. As Mark Ashton put it, it's important that if you're defending communities, you also defend all communities. And they found comrades in unlikely places. One LGSM member tells a story of collecting funds outside of Heaven, which was a kind of slightly fancier gay nightclub at the time, and often collections outside Heaven were difficult and even antagonistic. But one night, the woman working the door made entry to the club contingent on donating to LGSM, telling customers, you want to come in, you want to meet Mr. Right, you put some money in the bucket. If you don't pay, you don't get in. And I love this as an example of literal workers' power and the kind of ripple effects of solidarity.
So what the miners ultimately faced, however, was a more organized state than what they confronted in 1972 and 74, in addition to less union members and worse economic conditions for the working class in general, despite all the solidarity that was happening. The strike was sustained by 12 months by the support movement before the NUM voted to return to work in March of 1985, a time when aggressive policing, harsh bail conditions, and the cutting of benefits for workers were all strategies used by Thatcher's government and wider state forces to suppress the strike. So while on one hand, the rural mining communities did see plenty of supports coming their way, such as LGSM and other groups who have twinned with them, they also saw the presence of London Metropolitan Police, who traveled away from the city to picket lines that were often hours away. If you conceptualize this action into the history of policing, you will find that it is not surprising how Thatcher utilized law enforcement to combat the picket lines by controlling space and movements, as the police have always been used by reactionary forces to suppress not only labor movements, but all civil rights movements that have attempted to further human progress. The main objective of police in the strike was to restrict the mobility of miners by developing a series of roadblocks to prevent flying pickets from traveling from picket to picket. In this sense, the Thatcher government aimed to fundamentally transform the space of the picket line, reducing it to what historian Diarmaid Kelleher calls static space. The presence of London police outside of their authorized area showcased that solidarity can be developed not only through positive affirmation and understanding of shared characteristics, but also through shared antipathy or the recognition of a common enemy, such as the police. Mining communities gained support, most notably from Black Londoners because of what the police were doing to miners, as well as like it showcased, what the queer population in London was experiencing, because they were, usually at the forefront of, police brutality in every circumstances. Unfortunately, many miners, after the defeat of the strike, fell into this despair, mainly due to the financial toll and emotional strain. Feeling abandoned and having nowhere to turn, due to internal divisions in the NUM and the broader left, some men left the coal industry and some even resorted to suicide. When interviewed during the aftermath of the strike, a rural miner recalled that Thatcher had, to quote him, ripped our hearts out, and we felt it, that Thatcher had ripped our hearts out, and we really felt it back then. In line with making hope possible, however, it is worth acknowledging that the defeat of the strike was more complex than the narrative of simply the left's decline in the solidarity that was built. Notable movements that were developed by grassroots activists during the strike and endured long after include the South African anti-apartheid campaign that was based in Britain and the campaign against Thatcher's poll tax in the 1990s. The relationships built during the strike between mining communities, socialist organizations, and everyday people supporting the picket lines served as a lasting continuation of solidarity, according to historian Diarmaid Kelleher. I'm not good with Welsh names, yes. And have continued to provide inspiration and political resources up to today, 40 years later. When further quoted, the miner who discussed having felt that Thatcher ripped their hearts out, said that it was in fact not the case, and he elaborated more, saying, "The hearts of the people in our communities, and we're still here today, we're still fighting, and we've still got great friends."
So I think LGSM is a powerful example of how socialists can contribute to building effective coalition-based solidarity campaigns. The political development and network of cadre that socialist organizations can provide was key in this case to being able to act quickly and effectively when a struggle kicked off. And LGSM members who weren't organized socialists or even particularly politicized joined the campaign out of a hatred of Margaret Thatcher, which I think is quite relevant to note in our current political moment. As LGSM mobilized these members of their community into doing collections, this hatred became an organized and powerful force. At the same time, when socialists ignore or downplay issues of equity and struggles for liberation from various forms of identity-based oppression, they alienate people who know how to and want to fight the good fight. In this case, while leadership of other labor unions and of the British Labour Party distanced themselves from striking miners, as Eric spoke to, it was women, communities of color, and LGBT people, and rank-and-file members of other unions who played a vital role in sustaining the strike for as long as it went on. I also think the revolutionary optimism of LGSM could serve us well in our solidarity struggles and in the fight against the right today. At a recent meeting preparing for our conference discussions, our spring comrade Hiva made the point that the right scapegoats oppressed people to divert attention away from class consciousness and building class power. LGSM didn't make reciprocated solidarity a condition of their campaign, but they also took opportunities to meet with minors and their families without hiding who they were as queer people, which created a powerful and lasting solidarity. While the miners' strike ended in defeat, it was the membership of NUM whose votes made a crucial difference in the passing of LGBTQ rights resolutions at Labour Party and TUC conferences in the years following the strikes. And we see echoes of LGSM's legacy of solidarity today. So for instance, in a group in Britain that calls itself Lesbians and Gays Support the Migrants, and in groups closer to home here in Toronto, like Queers for Palestine, who have been organizing over the past year.
Yeah, so I guess just to conclude, I saw this quote on Instagram the other day, and it was quite enlightening to me. It said, "To be truly radical is to make hope possible rather than despair convincing." Perhaps today, more than ever, it is very easy for people to feel alone in their antipathy, which could result in despair rather than movement towards collective action. So I suppose a question that can be raised for our discussion is, how do we organize antipathy towards reactionary forces? What would that sentiment look like, and how would we express it? And what other lessons do you think we can learn from the Great Miners' Strike and LGSM? Thank you.